Hey everybody, welcome back. This is the Writing Bastards channel. I'm Drake here with my friend Neil,
What's up?
and today we're just going to be talking about plot. I mean, there's a lot to go with plot when writing a book, so we're going to be covering tons of good stuff today. Some of the stuff we're going to be just going over quickly, some probably a bit longer, mostly just how we outline, kind of the pros and cons of outlining, when's too much, too little, things like that. So, yeah. Neil, do you want to start or do you want me to start?
I can talk about outlining the book that I just outlined because I went start from finish just barely. It's fresh in my mind, and it's
Perfect.
been interesting because this is my third book, and each book I've outlined
Hmm.
more and more. And so my first one was like no outline. I just had an idea and I wrote it. And then I had to go back and rewrite everything after. My second one was like, I don't know, maybe 2 pages, so like a paragraph for each
Okay.
chapter that like roughly said what was going to happen, and then I had an idea of the world and like some notes built out, right, and like who the characters are going to
Hmm.
be, but still not much. And then this third one is the first time where I did like a full like proper outline. So
Okay.
lots of detail for each chapter. My outline itself was like close to 10 pages. And
Oh,
then
wow.
each character that was like a serious character had their own page that has a bunch of details about them, their backstory, appearance, their motivations, their flaws, what they're trying to have happen. So what's been interesting about doing it that way is I had to spend a bunch of time thinking about it before I started writing. And that
Hmm.
felt kind of weird because I was more used to like you write and then the ideas come as you're writing. And this time was
Hmm.
more just like visualizing and just like dumping the thoughts into my notes. Um,
Hmm. Okay.
and I actually liked it less. I'm like halfway into writing the book now, and I'm like, I think it makes the story worse actually for me.
Really?
Because
Wow. Okay.
it's planned out, but
Hmm.
I feel like there's less inspiration in the moment. And like every time you get into like a flow state when you're writing, you have really good
Hmm.
ideas about your story. And I'm basically shutting off the opportunity for that because I've already planned what it
Hmm.
should be. So I don't want to like change it, you know? Um,
Okay.
and actually I think you do get better ideas by spending the 2 to 3 months writing your book, thinking about the book, rather than
Hmm.
thinking about it for like a week or two and then you're done and then now you're just writing. So
Okay.
I
Okay.
feel like that's been not great. I think I'm gonna finish it just because I believe in finishing things that I start, but and I'll still learn by writing, you know. But I think for the next
Hmm.
one, I'm not gonna outline as much. I think the nice thing about outlining, this is like the pro, is it's just really easy to write once you outline it. Like
Hmm.
I know what's going to happen. There's not that much writer's block, and like I'm cranking through this one faster than any of my other books. So and
Yeah.
ideally there's going to be less revisions later on. So sort of saves some time, but to be honest, my mentality is very much like since I know the story, I'm just trying to like get through it now, and I don't like that. So I'm gonna go back to like
Hmm.
outlining less. That's my takeaway. But
Okay.
kick it back to you. How have you outlined? And I think you're outlining right now, or at least finished outlining. I don't know. You tell me for your latest book.
Yeah. So. That's crazy. I actually sorry, just to comment on yours. I was actually impressed that you said it's getting you feel like it's worse. Um, I was getting into this thinking he's gonna probably be like, dude, this is the best way to do it. Doing it this way from here on out totally just wrecks anything else, and I'm gonna be like, oh, so this has been my problem the whole time. So that actually was a huge shocker to me. So wow, okay,
Different
yeah.
strokes for different folks, maybe, but yeah.
Yeah, well, hey, that's I feel like I've heard a lot of authors talk about outlining and a lot of them really love it. So it's a bit shocker to hear, but no, I. Yeah, I'm kind of on the fence with outlining. In high school, I used to write a lot, and I kid you not, I should go find one of the notebooks. I know they're probably at my parents' house somewhere, but I had like 100-page outline, and it literally was almost like just kind of the entire book written, but it was kind of like nuts and bolts version, right? So there's no dialogue inserted, there was no like descriptions, but it was pretty much like play for play the book. And so all I would do is go in and kind of just fill in the missing gaps, which it would end up, maybe two sentences would end up being four or five in the actual book. So that was really cool to do it that way because I always knew where I was at. There was no, I did all the thinking. Um, but yes, I've changed drastically how I outline and do stuff now for my writing because as I've written more and more, I think I've begun to trust myself a bit more. I think outline is good when you're starting out because even to this day, my biggest fear when writing is that I write something and then it contradicts something I write here. That's always been my worry is, and I think that happens more with magic systems. I think that's why I hate magic systems a lot because for me, whenever I write them, I just like, oh, but would this contradict, and would this contradict, and so I have this new style of outlining that I have been trying, and it actually worked really good for my last book I had written, and so far I feel like it's going actually decently well for these two. It's interesting because what I like to do is I like to build the world, right? Because there are things I think you need to have established before you write. Kind of going off of inspiration doesn't always help. So, like for example, if you have armies, I think it's good to know like the flag, the symbol, basics about the cavalry. If they have like, are there knights? Are there foot soldiers? What kind of weaponry? I think that sort of world building is helpful. But when it gets to the actual outlining, I'm very much I think the best way I've described it is it's like I plan the boss battles of my book, which sounds and it's not like lit RPG. I don't classify my books as lit RPG, but that's actually how I do it because to me, if I always know the next step where they're going to be going, it's just getting there. That's part of the process. And it's become to the point where these bosses, like how I build them, that actually builds into the world and the lore. So one of my bosses, I'm just gonna call them bosses because it's easier to call it that way. But in the book I just wrote, as they're getting to the boss, everything around them is lore that builds about the boss, that tells you about the boss. So you look if you're paying attention to the scenery and things I'm describing, maybe look up some of the words or the symbolism of things. It all kind of builds up, and then the boss is like the crescendo where it's, whatever it is. And then when the boss themselves in their structure and in their armor, that gives more of the lore and the world building. I've tried to have more of like a Dark Souls approach to storytelling where it's very less detail, like less to little to no info dumps probably, but very much tons of detail. Like it's almost kind of probably verbose when I describe characters or bosses, but that's because that is me kind of hinting to the reader that these things aren't just standard. They're pay attention to these. You'll see them later. Um, so yeah, I've kind of turned to more of outlining as an outline the major kind of characters of the book. And similar, how do you do? What are their interests? What are your likes? What is their motivations? I do all of that. I think that's actually helpful because that keeps me a reminder of the character. Because you don't want a character acting out of character. That's always the one irritation. You want them to stay in character. So to me, that's actually a helpful note taking. Is that like I think in the one I'm writing because I my outlining's done. I'm just writing this new book. They I've literally written like doesn't enjoy breaking rules, likes following the rules, stern, staunch, like kind of descriptions of this person. So when I'm writing, if they hit a situation, they just don't suddenly like, oh, we're just gonna like screw all the rules, we're gonna do this. No, like if they're kind of staunch character who's like a rule follower, they're going to be like, no, guys, like this is bad because that is what I always try to do is keep them in character. So that's actually the one how you planned. I love planning characters like that. I love giving almost too much detail for characters because then I can refer to it and be like, oh, you know what? Especially in editing, that character didn't really act the right way. They didn't say the right thing, you know? I mean,
How
I think
how
things like
how
that.
long how long is like this most recent outline, for example? Like how many
How
pages
long is
across
my
characters
outline?
plus like yeah,
If
like
I
how many
actually,
pages dedicated to the characters and how many to the plot?
well, right now on that one like book I'm writing, this will give you like so the characters. It's 4 pages, but it's mostly 4 pages because I have it's like per character is a page. Um, I might be weird in my approach of doing this, but I actually like to find actors that I feel like fit the character. So not because I think there's ever going to be a movie made about any of these, but because it helps give me a very like fortified mental image. Because I can think of the character, but when I find someone that like really fits, like I'm like, oh yeah, that's totally like in my one book I'm writing now. Like I just can't unsee it now as one of the characters. I'm like, dude, that's just Carl Urban, hands down. Like that's just like especially in Star Trek, how he acts in that show. I'm like, dude, this is totally what I was envisioning. Like, so I have like a picture of him. So I'm like, totally like just suits. Not to bring him up again. God, I'm like fan casting and fanboying over this guy the last 2 weeks. But so I have 4 pages right now for characters, and as I build more characters, I put them in because I do kind of to some degree fly by the seat of my pants. I do like that in the flow um, inspiration. So I would say my actual outline is probably like 1 to 2 pages. But my struggle with outlines is I always know how I want it to start. I already know how it's going to end. It's like this tiny little middle chunk that I'm always like, what do I do with you? Like, it, I always have a hard time outlining that. I don't know why. I've struggled since I've been younger because I always try to outline the middle and it just never works. I'm never satisfied. It's never how I want it to be. And so I've learned with the middle, I just make just kind of go because usually what happens as I've learned is as I've been writing a character, writing the scenes and kind of the twists, the turns of the plot are taking place. Usually the best thing to do in the middle that I have found is I start maybe wrap a few of those up and then start some new ones. So kind of like the side characters, I've started to do this like halfway through the book, they resolve something that I started, but then they start something that they resolve at the end. So it's kind of like these short character arcs. And then the main character kind of has the big character that nothing, it doesn't really resolve till the end. I think that's actually been my favorite way to outline is, maybe like in the middle, there's a relationship, the one character dies. So now the other character, the last half of the book is them getting over that. Maybe the main character mentors them through that. I think those are kind of that's kind of generally the way I outline is have like my bosses lined up. It's like who they're going to be fighting through the whole book. That way I have all these cool battle scenes in my head to kind of, entertain people. But then, okay, so if they're going to fight this guy, how do they get there, right? And that's generally pretty easy to get there, right? Like the plot just kind of naturally will fit into it. At least for me, that's how it feels. Sorry,
I
that was really
think
long-winded.
no. I think I agree with the world building part.
Hmm.
Like personally, I find it pretty easy. Like if you've thought a lot about the world building and you add a lot of details from the beginning, I find it easier to do that before writing the book. And I think it doesn't
Yeah.
harm the writing at all to have all these details that don't like really affect the plot, but are just interesting. So I think that is, I want to do even more of that than I have before.
Hmm.
Um, I might be different from you in that even having the one page of the characters, I feel like kind of ruined my characters. And I
Really?
I think I'm better at discovery writing my characters within the
Hmm.
plot. and I come out with like better characters as I go. Whereas when I try to like sit and think about like who they should
Hmm.
be, it just doesn't work as well. Whereas I think outlining the plot works pretty well for me. But
Hmm.
yeah, so
Oh,
I don't know.
maybe I should
I
let
think
me
it
okay,
depends.
hold up, because let me read you one then, because like I feel like you, I want to make sure you're getting the right image of this, right? Okay, so my one character, right? This is random, but I have like personality, blunt, sarcastic, hard, follows rules when necessary, doesn't worry about breaking them if morality of the decision is greater than the rules, never says no to a good fight. That's kind of like my, and that's it. Then I like his favorite music is jazz, and he likes drinking whiskey and bourbon. I don't know. He just seems like a
It's
guy
kind of
that
like
would.
world building details, but yeah,
Yeah, it's that's about all I'm gonna do for
I
the
see.
characters. I have one that's like I just I have like one of the females is Scottish, so I have notes that like look up Scottish slang because the one thing I hate when writing is when you try and write an accent and they're always like, it's like ain't you doing like and all the words are like y'all you and it's all janky. I prefer to just find like slang and just insert the
Yeah,
slang. So then people are like, what the heck is this? And oh. But that's all I do with my characters. I guess you could say more world building characters because I don't really plan their story. I mean, even though I know how it's gonna end, I don't plan how it gets
yeah.
there as much.
Mine was more detailed, so like yeah, I probably would go back down to your level of detail. Um,
Okay.
but what I did is I mapped out like literally like here's their motivations, like here are the
Hmm.
reasons why they're likable. Here are their
Oh wow.
flaws. Like here's some of the reasons why you might not like them. So
Oh
it's like
wow.
very like tried to get
Okay.
into like each character super deeply and the with the
Okay.
goal of making them good characters, but it works
Hmm.
better if I let the plot kind of mold them. And this brings me to my second point about uh like if you get too much outlining if it's good. And my goal with outlining a lot was so that I wouldn't have to go back and rewrite large sections of it, like of the
Okay.
story, because I just hate doing that and it takes a long time. I like the first draft more.
Hmm.
Um, but multiple
Yeah.
books
Would
in
agree.
now of writing, I've learned to enjoy it more, and I've also learned that it's just inevitable. Like you're just
Hmm.
gonna have good ideas as you write the first draft that you're gonna write down, even if you plan the outline, and you're gonna want to fix them anyway. And so that's kind of where I'm at. Is I'm like, it's like almost unavoidable. So I'd rather the first
Mm.
draft to be really a little bit more of like a free flowing like stream of
Hmm.
information with the expectation that I'll edit it later, rather than trying to make the first draft be like a perfect one. And I think that's like the downside of outlining a lot is you put too much pressure on the first draft. Um, so anyway,
Yeah.
um,
No. Totally can
maybe
see that.
I'll transition us to still talking about plot, how to have good pacing, and are there any examples you can think of books that have good pacing versus bad pacing?
Yeah. Pacing. I think pacing's hard in general. Um, I think the books that I can immediately say struggle the most with pacing is epic fantasy because they're always bricks and but here's the catch. When I read epic fantasy, I immediately assume when I pick up the book, I'm like, there's going to be a lot of just dead time in this book. There's going to be characters chilling around a fire, eating, drinking, smoking, and just kind of chatting, right? Like that's just kind of it's going to probably happen. So I think with epic fantasy, I'm already setting up with that expectation that this is an investment of time, so it doesn't usually bother me much. I mean, I read one book. It's Musashi by Eiji Yoshikawa, and that book is like literally just about Musashi's journey as a character, and the fighting is super quick. It's very realistic fighting, and I read the whole book and loved it. And I was like, holy cow! Like there's so much about like sitting and drinking and having tea and like meditating in this book, but the characters were phenomenal. I mean, it was a book that I feel like the plot was not very exciting, but the fact that these characters were just so layered and written made it really good. So I think pacing kind of has to tie in with good written characters because if people are invested in the characters, you can have really crappy pacing and people would still be like, no, this character's good. Like I need it. I mean, I think like people are still invested in One Piece. And it's been like 30 years. I don't even know how long. So the pacing has to be slow at some point. Like, you don't just write these epic lengths without slowness. But yeah, I think high epic fantasy kind of takes the automatic it's got slow pacing, but it can be good and it can be bad. But
Those are good examples. I was going to say the same thing when I get feedback on my
hmm
drafts. The chapters people don't like and say that they get disengaged on are when I'm like having a chapter about characters that they don't care about, or
hmm
it's something that like the characters are doing that like doesn't make sense to them or like feels like wrong, So I agree. I think characters can carry you. Um,
hmm
and that is a good point. Like thrillers or whatever are gonna have faster pacing.
Yeah.
They have to. That's kind of what you
Yeah.
expect. So
hmm
totally genre specific.
Yeah.
I think an example is people always say Red Rising has fast pacing. Um,
Okay. Have you read any of them?
but I'm like partway through the first book and
Uh,
I actually like don't
are you
I
stuck on
don't
page
feel like
120?
pretty much.
Is it really like around 120?
Something like that. But
Okay.
I was like the pacing actually is not drawing me in that much. So there might just be like personal preference and maybe my preferences have changed over time. But yeah, that one people say it is, and like things happen, right? Like it doesn't
hmm
linger. So I think like objectively speaking, the storyline does move along. So maybe that's what people are saying. Um, but here's the thing: is like there are books that have so much suspense
mm
and like intensity that something might not really happen in the plot, but it draws you in and makes you turn the pages. Um,
Yes.
so that's what I always think about is like how
hmm
to have that effect because I think that's better than like a plot that moves quickly just for the sake of moving quickly. So I don't know. It
Yeah.
sounds like you had some thoughts on Red Rising, but
Yeah. So I so my dad had started reading Red Rising and he actually stopped, I think, around page 180 to 120. I'm actually picking up a trend here with people that read Red Rising because I always ask them if they've stopped. I'm like, was it around like page 80 to 120 that you just stop? And pretty so far, like 90% of people always say, yeah, that's right where I stopped. How did you know? So my dad actually introduced me to it because I, he introduced me to it and he said this book was terrible because I just saw it on his shelf and he's like, horrible book. I'm like, what? Like my dad reads a lot of books and he's never really had a strong like dislike of a book. He's like, I hated that book. And I was like, why? He's like, it was slow. It was weird. They made these like Cupid people with wings and like these pink people. And I was like, okay. So like the fact that he disliked it, I'm like, I have to read this book now. And I read the first book and I was like, okay. I gave it to my dad because I read the whole thing. And I was like, Dad, you got to get past page 120 because it does pick up. But the first book is I feel like is a slow burn and then it picks up. But I watched an interview after with the author, and he said he wrote the book to kind of be like a keyhole into the world, where he doesn't go into a ton of detail, but just kind of grabs people, interests them, and then ends it, right? Which the more I think about that, that's a lot of first books, like first time authors' first books. They're very short, quick. I mean, like Harry Potter, that was like a 306 pages or something. Quick, you get in, you get out. That's kind of the approach for first time authors is you just kind of like want to come in with this like jab to the nose that people are like, whoa, actually kind of good. But I have to say, Golden Sun, the second book in that is nuts. Like that was one when I was done with that book, I was like sitting in shock. A book has never left me in shock. Like I've most books I read, I'm like, oh yeah, okay. That book, I just like, I had to go and buy the third book immediately after because I was like, what? Because that book, it like starts with a battle and it's just like nonstop, like 190 miles an hour, just going, 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 and all this stuff is happening. I'm like, wow, like that was a book that had like fast pace, fast plot, and huge payoffs. So I'd have to say, I would at least, if I were you, read to the end of the second book. And if you hate the second book, then you should stop. But the second book, I think I was gonna say, in my opinion, out of all the books I've read, that has had the best pacing of any book I've ever read.
Hmm.
Just because it's quick, it's fast, meaningful things though still happen, and I think it helps that it's in space because there's like the downtimes are kind of like they're flying to the next like mission or something, right? I mean, I think that's the best thing with sci-fi is that like when they're in like hyperspace or like slip space or whatever space and the characters are just kind of like confined, that is like a great time to like, build relationships, chit chat, other stuff, but you still feel like you're moving, right? Whereas like in fantasy, they set up a camp and they're just like sitting. It kind of just feels like you're like, we're going and stop, going and stop. Where I feel like sci-fi avoids that with the whole space travel. So I think that's why the book works so well because
Hmm.
when they're traveling, that's where he built it all. So it was like action sequence build, action build, and I think that's why the that I think that is my theory on why sci-fi tends to have better like fluid plots because the space travel just like it's inevitable. It has to take time. Like we are still going forward, but you just can't you gotta wait. Whereas in fantasy, I feel like sometimes it's like, well, they're resting, but like, why do they have to be resting? Like, can't they just take a magic potion and keep going? Like, I don't know.
Yeah, I think like ships are more dynamic environments
Hmm.
um, than like a random campsite. So,
Yeah.
I mean, it makes sense that there's like more that could happen. It's sort of like a living space to be in, pun
Hmm.
intended. Um,
A living.
uh,
Oh
but
gosh.
okay, the next thing is there's sort of a spectrum between how much a book focuses on the plot versus the characters, and
Mm.
I want to talk about that. So, first of all, outside of like fantasy, just books in general,
Hmm.
novels in general, some books are completely focused on the characters. They like don't even have a
Mm.
plot.
True.
So like for example, like one that I think of that's quite popular is this book called Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow. I think that's what it's called.
Tomorrow,
And
tomorrow, tomorrow. I heard you right. Right?
Tomorrow,
It's
Tomorrow and Tomorrow, I think.
okay. All right, all right. Just want to
Might
make
have
sure I
might
heard
have
that right.
might have missed a tomorrow in there somewhere, but
Oh gosh.
it's it's a popular book. It's about these kids like going to Ivy League college and then their relationships and then they like start like a game dev studio and
Okay.
so there's like some elements of like they're doing things and like a little bit of progression, but the point is not the plot. The point is like their inner world and just the experiences they have and it's and so anyway, a lot of people like it, but that's like
Okay.
obviously the plot is not going to be as interesting as a thriller or like fantasy or
Oh
sci-fi.
yeah.
And then when you think within like fantasy, for example,
Hmm.
we were kind of talking about how fantasy is in general more plot driven, but
Yes.
there's sort of a
Yeah.
spectrum. Like Robin Hobb's books, I think people generally say she's more of like a character focus
Hmm.
person.
I
She
I have
has
heard
really
that.
good characters. And then maybe in the middle is like a Brandon Sanderson where he
Yeah.
has plot, but the characters are consistent. Like let's say Stormlight Archives, for example, like they
Mm.
similar characters throughout a lot of it, and they build, and then he still has
Yeah.
fewer characters than Steven Erikson. And this is an interesting topic. Is people always say because he wrote his 10 book series. They're all 1,000 pages, and each of his books at the start has a list of characters, and there's like 200 of them. It's like pages,
That's a
and
long list.
some of them exist like throughout multiple books, but it's like people have criticized his characters, and
Hmm.
his response to that, he wrote like a post responding online.
I
Um,
love the post. The post cracked me up. I've read it a few times. It makes me laugh.
yeah, he basically compares, like, he's like, okay, look, like, I could write characters in the way that some people want them to be written, where it just
Hmm.
tells you about them. And then, so he gives an
Yeah.
example, and then he gives another example of how he likes to do it, and it's oftentimes not from the perspective of that character. Like, he
Yes.
teaches you about the character from several viewpoints and
Hmm.
gives you like little information here and there. And so that's why his books are like there's so much going on in the world and in the plot that you sort of
Hmm.
get to know the characters that way, and it's not as much of like a first person experience. Um,
Yeah,
and
I can see
so
that.
some people don't like it, and I think it's fair to say that maybe like super deep retrospective emotional experiences with the characters is not his goal. Um,
Hmm.
and he's just somewhere on that spectrum. So
Yeah.
I think it's interesting to consider like which one you are. I think people naturally gravitate towards one direction or another.
Mm.
But yeah, I don't know if you had any thoughts on that concept of more plot driven versus
Yeah, I'm just
character.
just just articulating my thoughts. Yeah, I think with all with character building and characterization, I actually really do like Steven Erikson's characters. I mean, I'm still reading the first book that you got me into, but I don't dislike it. If people, I think it's funny that people think he can't write them or is hard to write because I read one book, Shadow of the Torturer, and I'll tell you what, that is like 100. It's like a 200. It's a very short book, maybe 200 pages, maybe even less, and it's a hard book to understand because you have to be focused, and so much happens kind of in like a sentence or in between the lines, and by actions. Like you learn about characters based off what they do, and I actually really like that in books. I don't like it when I get info dumped or people tell me about a character, like how they're gonna act, right? Because to me, in real life, I don't know if you were told this, but I was always told that like, you know, people will tell you things, but you can see who they really are by what they do, right? That wasn't very catchy. There's probably a good quote for that, but I don't have it. But my parents always told me that like, it's nice what people say, but pay attention to what they do. Because that tells, especially when I was like younger trying to find friends, they're like, you'll find good friends by seeing them make good choices, and you find bad friends by, the ones that make bad choices. I think every parent has told their child something like that. But I think that applies directly to writing characters because if I want like to show a character that's aggressive, he's not gonna say like, "Oh, I'm so aggressive. I want to punch you." Because I read some books like that where like the character's pretty much telling you like, "Ergar, I'm aggressive. Like you make me angry. We're not friends. We're instead, if you don't like someone, you just don't talk to them. Or if you're aggressive, you get up in their face. You don't need dialogue for that. They get, if you write in the book and like just the prose that like so and so gets up in so and so's face, grabs hold of his shirt, and like puts him into his face. Like that to me is like, huh. Like he initiated, and you can kind of tell. But I think it comes down to readers. I think some people like, I don't want to offend by saying this, but like a lazy read. I like a lazy read where I can sit back, I can almost turn my brain off and just, and then I still get the plot, right? Um, I think Erickson writes more of where you have to be an active reader, where you need to be paying attention and be present in the story. Um, I think Sanderson, he's kind of like a middle ground where you kind of need to be present, but you don't need to be super present, like kind of a middle ground. And I think that's kind of like a good place to be when you're writing characters is you want to have readers be able to be active, but not to the point where it's like I'm studying it. Because I almost feel like that was Shadow of the Torture, where it's like I had to like study the book. I was getting online and like looking up Reddits and like it's actually a huge discussion. There's lots of controversial discussions about it. So it was fun in its own regards, but yeah, I think when I write characters, the thing I like to do is, if I want them to be a certain way, I just present that in the character and how they act. If they're going to be rough and tough, the narrator isn't like, so and so's a rough and tough guy. He's a cowboy. Like, no, if I have a cowboy, it's like maybe there'll be a scene where he puts on a cowboy hat and maybe, some stereotypical things. Maybe he has like a gun in his holster, um, spits tobacco out, walks across, talks in a gritty, rough accent. To me, that just builds so much more for the reader than me just saying he's a rough and tough cowboy, right?
Yeah. I think you captured Stephen Erickson's book perfectly by saying you need to be a little more of an active reader.
Hmm.
Um, they are like a little more dense and intense, and I think there's a good like general concept too of like easier reads versus not, and
Okay.
you hear anecdotes like I don't know if we've talked about this before, but like all the people on like book talk who are talking about they started with romantasy and then they started reading actual
Uh,
fantasy and they're like, oh my gosh, like
yeah.
the writing is so much better. It's not to say that romantasy authors are bad writers. It's that they have a certain genre and audience that they're writing towards. Like I'm
Yes.
sure they could write a different type of book if they wanted to, but
Hmm.
so there's like that level of consumption and like fantasy is maybe here. And then
Hmm.
somebody was talking about how they knew someone who wanted to write fantasy books and then they started reading a lot of the like world classic literature, like a lot of like the
Mm.
Russian literature and stuff like that. And
Yeah.
they started to hate fantasy because they thought that that literature is just so much better. And so there's
That's
sort of like
funny.
levels, of what you want to enjoy. And
Yeah.
um, so, yeah, that can play into, I guess, what genre you write.
Yeah,
Uh,
I
let's
I would agree. I would agree.
let's wrap it up with maybe the last interesting thing on plot is tropes. So like things that
Oh,
happen
tropes.
in fantasy and
Oh.
some of the good and bad ones. So some of those on the top of my head, magical sword or magical weapon that saves things. Um, the mysterious wanderer mentor person, uh, person who's sort of like outcast, but then comes back and reclaims
Dude, you're just bagging on
whatever
Star
their
Wars right now.
rightful place. I mean, Lord of the Rings spawned all these things, right? Like
Okay, you got a point.
it happens over and over again, right? Um, so I I think tropes are generally good. Like people always talk about how they're like
Mm,
bad and you need to like not have anything that's a trope. But I disagree. Like I don't think you should reinvent the wheel, especially because just having good characters is like so much of a book that
yeah.
just putting that in an environment that people like, people are probably gonna like it, right? Um,
Hmm.
so I that's why I think about that, especially some of the more like minor like aesthetic choices, like again, like magical
Oh.
sword, like that's just kind of cool. But it doesn't really like
Hmm.
affect things. Whereas if it's more of like a character's plot line or like story arc, and I feel like I know what's gonna happen, that I think is less satisfying.
Okay,
Um,
yeah.
that's what I think. I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I think the biggest problem with tropes is when it's like transplanted. Like it feels like you literally took another book and just renamed the characters. I think that's the biggest problem. Kind of with like I don't know, with the magic swords, I don't mind because that to me, there's like certain things that define fantasy. Same with sci-fi. And you kind of need they're not bad to have. You need because if you take all the tropes away, like you end up just having like just like a historical book, but it's in a different world. Like, and you could write a fantasy book like that with no magic. I think that would be interesting as a fantasy book that has absolutely no magic in it. That is just kind of gritty. I think that could work in its own right. But I think the things you tend like my I think we were talking about this once is a trope that I hate, and I could be wrong. If anyone's watching this and they know, because I'm going to say this, please comment if you know, because my biggest irritation with all fantasy is like I call it the red-headed woman trope. I told you about this. I don't know if you remember it, but I call it the red-headed woman trope. So if anyone knows a book where there's a red woman that just doesn't kind of complain and just kind of be kind of like this weird spunky that's not funny or just kind of generally annoying, please comment because I really hate it. Like I always feel like in fantasy they make the redheads out to be just kind of like I don't know, they just rip me out. It's like a storm. I don't like Shalon. She just annoys me. She's like whiny. She has all these like she's just kind of like she's all over the place. Maybe that's the point of her character is to be all over the place, but like it's not in a good way to me. It's just kind of like why? Like why do you act this way? You know, like almost like immature. One that bugs me less, that still kind of bugs me though, is Caitlin Stark. I think all this. Well, I guess all like there's a couple redheads in the Starks, and to me, they bother me less because in Game of Thrones there tends to be a lot of like almost historical gender roles that are very like forced upon people, and so you kind of see that like they have to work their way around it, and so there are like annoying times with those characters, but I generally feel that they have better like character arcs. They tend to work a bit better because I'm like, okay, they are confined, but whereas Stormlight, I feel like there's not really there's supposed to be a confined gender role, but like by the time I'm in the fourth book, like Sanderson is kind of getting away, like he's kind of breaking him. Like in his books, it's kind of like to the point where like the men can't read, but one of the men has learned to read. And like the women are kind of breaking into the other roles, like they can't eat spicy food. And I just am like, okay, that's cool. Like you're kind of breaking your own world building. Like, oh, okay. But to me, her character just still comes off as really just like annoying. Like not a very interesting character. And I've read lots of fantasy where I feel like they throw the annoying character into the redhead people. I mean, like even Ron Weasley. I shouldn't even say it's the woman redhead. It's just a redhead. Like Ron in the books was pretty good, but in the movie, he just like they kind of make him an airhead. I'm like, man, do people just like I don't get why that so in fantasy I've just noticed there's a lot of redheaded people that just are kind of like off. And not like that's part of their character, they're just off. Like either they're dumb, they're like just whiny. I mean, even the Witcher games kind of suffer from this too. The Witcher kind of suffers this with Triss Merigold, but she has some better moments too, kind of like the Starks. If I like to tier list them, she's up towards the top more. But that's one trope that I hate is like kind of when you have very like characters that always fit the role. It's kind of like romantasy. Another trope I hate in romantasy is I say all the love interests end up looking like Jon Snow. Like it's a dude that's kind of edgy, that has black long curly hair, that's like masculine, but he's a gentleman, but she doesn't know, and he's kind of rude to the girl at first, but then somehow they get to know each other, and then he's like soft and gentle teddy bear. I'm like, oh my heck, like we like
This
come
is
on.
this is something interesting. Is people on Book Talk will like comment and be like, "Does it have enemies to lovers?" Like they're like looking for tropes. Like they want certain tropes and they just want to read it over
Yeah,
and over again. Um,
yeah. I mean
so
that's good.
it's
For people that like it, it's good, but
right. Well, they've taken it to a degree of official like categorization much further than most other genres I know of.
hmm
Um, and yeah, I'm not someone who loves that in my books, I think. Like I generally am looking to read something new or slightly different or
hmm
a familiar vibe but a new take on something, or just something that's good, right? Like just high quality. The tropes
hmm
matter to me less. So, I guess it depends on who you are, but
I think one trope that I really like that I thought was subvert, like they didn't do it, and it was a really cool way they didn't do it, but it kind of was weird at the same time, was Star Wars. because it sets you up in the fourth episode when Luke saves Princess Leia that like, oh, he saves the princess. Like it's always the main hero that
Mm.
gets like the princess, you know. That's just how it always goes. But I like how in the second one it's like they totally just like curveball and they're like, give it to the side character. What if the kind of rogue side character hooked up with and got with the princess instead of the main guy? I mean, Star Wars kind of sucks. Like Luke gets like all like he doesn't get anyone in the end. I think everyone pretty much like ends up with someone kind of. He's like his dad is dead. He lost everyone. Like and the even worse I feel like for Luke is like the girl that you had the hots for turned out to be your sister. Like oof, like you got a rough break, dude. Like oof. So
Han is, I feel like everyone likes Han. Yeah, like he's kind of the
yeah,
main guy, I feel like.
it's Harrison Ford.
Um,
Everyone who doesn't like Harrison Ford.
that's true.
It's
And even between Luke and Darth Vader, Darth Vader's
mhm.
the interesting one, you know?
Yeah.
Like you like the moments between them because Darth Vader's like a pretty cool bad guy.
Yeah,
Um,
no, I think
and
Star Wars did that good.
Luke's basically like just an arbitrary good person, like just generally
Yeah,
vaguely good. And
yeah,
it's kind of uh like a lot of shows do the reverse where it's there's just something that's like evil and you just know they're evil and they kind of exist to make the good character more interesting. But yeah, it's like
exactly. Yeah,
flipped. Um,
yeah. So I
well,
think that one broke a lot of tropes really well. That's what I liked
mm,
about Star Wars a lot. Is that because I feel like even in fantasy that happens all the time where you save the princess and they get married. It's basic fairy tale story. I think that's a trope I don't like a ton, but
yeah,
yeah, I think Star Wars
one
did that
more
excellent.
one more example is Joe Abercrombie. I think his second series, like Half a King or whatever. Um,
Okay,
he's pretty reasonably popular fantasy author. I don't know, like 20 years ago, it was like his debut.
he has a lot of good
So
books. He has pretty popular though, really popular.
yeah, he's got multiple series, but this one, the main guy is like royal lineage, and it is sort of like the trope of like he leaves his realm and has to like come back and claim it again,
Okay.
but he's like uh crippled and
Oh,
they he just explores that really well.
that'd be
And
interesting.
that's an example of like it's a general plot line that we're all kind of expecting and generally like
Hmm.
people like it, but he just takes a slightly new twist on it that makes it interesting. I feel like that's a really great way to like handle tropes, stay in genre,
Yeah.
but do something that's like slightly new. So
Yeah, I think it's like boiled down to like plotline tropes tend to be acceptable because it's what makes the genre, but it's changing the twist so it feels fresh. I mean, I think Shrek did that too, where Prince Charming's like this massive tool, and the good guy's this ugly ogre. Like, I think that one did a really
right.
good subversion of it too, where it's like, oh, and then the princess, that twist where she's actually like, half ogre, and I think that was actually people probably bag on Shrek a lot, but I feel that like was a really good twist in it because you're like, whoa. I remember when I was a kid and I
She's
saw it, and I was like, whoa.
she's a good redhead.
My gosh, she is. I just answered my own
Yeah,
question, didn't I? Holy
yeah.
crap. Dude, this whole time she's just been
There
flying
we go.
incognito. Wow, thanks, dude. You just solved my problems. Yeah, she kicks butt too. She does like kung fu on all this, like Robin Hood,
And
and that's another one I love about
explodes
Shrek
the
too.
birds.
That's like, yeah. Yeah, I think Shrek's a great example because you have like Robin Hood, who's supposed to be like the hero, who is once again kind of these like tool. I think that's the thing that Shrek does well is it makes all these old fairy tale guys who are super cool and heroic just kind of you're like, oh yeah, like in real life, if you were like had a legend written about you, you probably would be a bit of a dirtbag. Like, yeah, that's me.
That
Like,
that is what it is, right? It's
it's yeah, it's
subverting
and
all the fairy
yeah,
tales. Like Pinocchio's a
all of them.
weirdo. Um,
Yep, yep,
yeah. So
yeah. That's the best like change up all the tropes that I could think of because all the good guys are bad guys. The bad guys tend to be the good guys. Like even the dragons in fantasy usually are bad. The
Yeah,
dragons like, and it's a female dragon. I feel like that's even less common to see. I mean, it got more common, I feel like, after Aragon and stuff started coming out, but back in the time, like, I mean, and he doesn't have a horse, he has a donkey, which is like the inferior version of the horse. So I think, yeah, I think Shrek was the
and
ultimate every trope it broke.
yeah, like fairy godmother too. She's bad.
Yeah, she's evil. She's the
It's like
bad guy. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, no,
that's
so
totally true. Um,
moral of the story
well,
is Shrek is the best at trope breaking.
yeah.
Oh,
On
that's
that note,
awesome.
we'll catch y'all next time.
Yeah, thank you guys for watching. If you liked our stuff, feel free to give a comment, like, and subscribe. And we'll see you guys next time.
See ya.